Remember, remember, the 5th of November, the Gunpowder Treason and Plot. I know of no reason why the Gunpowder Treason should ever be forgot. Guy Fawkes and his companions did the scheme contrive to blow the king in Parliament, all up alive. 70 barrels laid below to prove old England's overthrow. But by God's providence, him they catch with a dark lantern lighting a match. A stick and a stake for King James' sake. If you won't give me one, I'll take two. The better for me and the worse for you. A rope to hang the Pope. A penn'orth of cheese to choke him. A pint of beer to wash it down. And a jolly good fire to burn him. Helloa, boys! Helloa, boys! Make the bells ring. Helloa, boys! Helloa, boys! God save the king. Hip, hip, hooray! And now, the Crusade Channel's On Demand presents the Mike Church Show's The 5th of November, the real Guy Fawkes story revealed, featuring historian Ryan Grant.
So here's what 5th of November, Guy Fawkes Day is all about, according to the official English government story. So I'm going to call it 5th November, a conspiracy theory. So on the 5th of November, a plan was about to be executed by a string of Catholics who were angry over the King James's persecution of the Catholic Church in England, which he'd inherited from Elizabeth, and therefore gathering together all their money and talents, and an English mercenary in the pay of the Spanish named Guy Fawkes, who was an expert in gunpowder, contrived to put together a plan to blow up the king in Parliament using gunpowder, which was admitted to be decayed and would never have worked, as well as all people who were already in the pay of the English government to carry out this work, but you're not allowed to notice this particular fact. Nevertheless, they also were in league with the Pope, whom they had never met or spoken to, and with the Jesuits to carry out this act as it was to bring a Catholic era in England, which at that time was a majority country of Protestants. And first trying to dig a mine into the lower end of Parliament, they saw this didn't work, so went to the easy route of renting the hall underneath Parliament, which, as Catholics and formerly arrested in a plot, were known to the government to be Catholic agitators, yet somehow were able to rent it without any problem. And then, carrying out their plan on the 5th of November, or the night before, James being warned by a letter which nobody could understand until he looked at it and saw by divine revelation that Parliament would receive a great blow, meant someone was going to blow it up with gunpowder. Who would have thought? Ordered the Houses of Parliament to be searched, finding Guy Fawkes there with a match and a lantern, such as in the poems and in the images and everything, and therefore was arrested, taken to the Tower, whereas the ringleaders of the entire thing, Robert Cecil and Thomas Percy, are conveniently executed on sight by the sheriff in Holbeach, with all the rest taken away and put in the Tower to be tortured and eventually give up any information they known, hang, drawn, and quartered, all of them, and great celebration, and then fireworks to honor the gunpowder that never would have gone up anyway, but if it did, would have killed everybody. So therefore you have Guy Fawkes Day.
That's a very long and lengthy explanation.
So it's essentially the government story at the time. Amongst historians, there are very few that cling to that particular narrative, that it was born and nested from these guys, and completely unknown to the government until they were saved at the last minute by what's known as the Monteagle letter, which I referred to. And so almost nobody holds to that anymore. And it was, that was the official government account right after the fact. So there's a second and a third opinion. The second one is the most popular amongst historians. It's the one I'm going to argue against, which is that the main plotters, Robert Cecil, Thomas Percy, John Wright, Christopher Wright, Francis Tresham, John Grant, no relation, Guy Fawkes, etc., and Thomas Winters, they're the main figures anyway in the plot. So the view is that they established their plot, they prepared a started, getting, and as they continued to network and raise more funds, knowledge of it came to the English government, which decided to let it grow and continue to watch it, plan it, and then even supply it at times, and then finally make the arrest so that there was no actual danger of it happening. So that's the second view. My view is a third view, which is that and I'm not the only one that has this, by the way, but it's a less liked version because it involves conspiracy theory.
Ooh, here we go.
But anyway, that essentially there's a combination of things that we'll go into that makes this more and more plausible as you go along when you look at it with the evidence, which is that Robert Cecil, who is the Lord Secretary of State, Lord of Salisbury, he comes up with the plot, and as a way basically to ensnare the Jesuits, bring Catholics into disrepute, but more importantly, for himself, to justify his importance to the new king, who's Scottish, and secondarily, to eliminate the danger of an English regiment of soldiers serving in the pay of the King of Spain in Flanders, only a ship, ride away. And that's the big thing that's on his mind, and that's the big point of history, the Flanders regiment that is in Belgium, which nobody, you very rarely see addressed in any of the historical literature because it's the one glaring thing that throws the official narrative into chaos, and as we'll see.
Is there new scholarship on Guy Fawkes and the Gunpowder Plot that you're about to reveal, or is this just a result of you choosing to study this and finding some inconsistencies, and the propaganda, the winner writes the history narrative and what actually happened?
It's the fruit of my reading and challenging the sources in the scholarship that's making the position that I'm going to talk about today.
Okay.
Which is that I read the book with a sympathetic eye. So this is actually the main work that I used was a work by Father Francis Edwards, S.J., The Enigma of the Gunpowder Plot. Now, Edwards is an excellent historian, busy in the state papers, and at some point became very much involved in unraveling some of the history of the Gunpowder Plot. Another author was a Jesuit in the 19th century named Father John Gerard, not to be confused with the same the same Jesuit of the same name actually in this very time period in the 17th century. And he wrote a book, What Was the Gunpowder Plot? And he examines, at that time, new evidence that had surfaced that kind of called this into question. It was one of the very first books arguing that just maybe this was all state-sponsored terror. And the opinion surfaced again in the 1930s in various historical articles, principally because, for the last 50 years, the English in general and the Jesuits also had been pushing the canonization of Henry Garnet, who was the Jesuit superior at the time, who was arrested and alleged to have been connected with this plot. If he was truly a conspirator, he could not be canonized as a martyr because he was executed in connection with the plot. And so what some of the Jesuits here, and in this case Edwards, is trying to show is that he was a victim of the plot in a hatred for the faith, so it makes him easily a martyr. So at the time, Rome was kind of like, well, we're not sure, we need more evidence. And so the fruit of the digging is kind of on the part of this Jesuit named Edwards, who, so I went through his sources as much as I could verify them going, and, I kept finding, right again. All the connections, he draws all the connections that, are usually missed out to the English regiment in Flanders, and some other important stuff that'll mention that kind of calls into question the whole thing. And there's other historians who acknowledge, like Antonia Fraser, for example. She's on the side of the second view, that the government caught wind of this and let it enlarge and so on and so forth. But at the same time, she acknowledges some of the problems in the story and a lot of this very same evidence. And there's a few other historians in the same way. Alice Hodges, God's Secret Agents, which is actually a fairly good book historically. She makes mistakes in terminology here, but in general, it's a really good book on the whole thing of Jesuits and Catholic priests and the English mission and the government activities against them. So but let's kind of backtrack so people can kind of understand the situation, and we'll get into then how the plot forms and where the evidence more or less fits.
But then I wanted to just comment quickly. when I edited Father Gerard Culkin's book, The English Reformation, which was conveniently taken out of print by the Oxford Press in 1960, and Father died in 1962. When I edited that book, it was following all his footnotes up and checking his notes and all that. I stumbled upon, and Father kind of intimated this, Ryan, but he didn't flesh it out. So I went down the rabbit hole, kind of like you did. And I said, well, wait a minute. Was there ever really a plot or did the ending their careers or their lives as Catholics and becoming Anglicans, did they ever actually really have a synod to develop the liturgy for what we call the Anglican Rite today? And the answer is no, they didn't.
No.
They said they had one. They lied. And they took it to the king, who was 9 years old at the time, and said that, oh, no, we had a synod. No, they didn't. And I think I demonstrated it in it's the lengthiest footnote in the English Reformation book. It's almost 2 pages long, but I wanted to get it in. So there's a lot going on here in England at the time. And, of course, 40 years later, during the Inquisition, or what we call the Inquisition, it's the English Protestants that are printing the tracts that are being shipped into France and to Spain that are the source of the urban legend about Isabella and Ferdinand killing all the Jews and doing all the things that they were doing that were just totally fabricated. What an irony that they're vindicated by the BBC in 1993 in a documentary that you can still watch on YouTube. So I just wanted to set up that there is ample evidence that the English made things up in order to force feed the English population what we call the Anglican Rite today. Now, I think I'm right on that, or would you agree with that assessment?
I would agree that there's a lot of fabrication. I mean, there's fabrication in various places. You also see it on the Catholic side, but and the part of that, you got to take stock of the black legend of English history, which is for political motives, it was thought expedient. You got to remember the English are at war with the Spanish during that time. That actually plays into what we're going to talk about today. So it was expedient to make up these various tracts and to depict things, and people would just kind of let their lurid imaginations go, whatever the engravers could come up with. And you would see things that were known to exist in Germany, for example. You would see things that were known to exist in France, but had never been seen or used in Spain. So like Iron Maiden, for example, that shows up frequently in a lot of the old propaganda about the Inquisition. No, never has one been found in Spain. We have a lot of old stuff intact all over the place. And in Germany, which suffered a lot more devastation from war, you still have plenty of examples of the Iron Maiden. But you don't see them in Spain, because it wasn't used. And it was actually illegal to use stuff like that. So at the most, you look at a lot of inquisitorial files, very dry. And they're writing in a Catholic country for a Catholic king, so they're writing what's actually going on. There's no reason to sugarcoat anything or change anything. So whenever they're dealing with the noted heretic, there's all the things that's in that BBC documentary that they noted, and they're not allowed to apply torture without episcopal approval.
Right.
And it's all documented. So and most of the time, all they did was kind of it's called menacing with torture. You show them the answers. Come on, you don't want this, do you? And then anything at all that shows any kind of contrition, they let them off. Mostly because the Inquisition was actually very unpopular, and people didn't, wouldn't cooperate with it. Excuse me. They wouldn't cooperate with it. They wouldn't go along. So, But anyway, we're getting further afield with all that type.
Okay, let's go back to the Gunpowder Plot. Remember the 5th of November. Okay. Pick it up where you left off.
All right, so we backtrack to Queen Elizabeth. Obviously, so Mary's on the throne, restores Catholicism. She dies in 1558, and Elizabeth comes to the throne. So in 1559, actually I should say in Christmas of that year, 1558, she sent a letter to the Bishop of London, who was celebrating the Christmas pontifical mass, asking him not to elevate the host. And so he sent a letter back that the bishop will not be ordered how to say mass by the laity. And then, so Elizabeth walked out with all her court. It's called the Gloria in Excelsis walkout. It was during the Gloria that she walked out of the church. Then retired to the Chapel Royal, where she said the litanies, which meant, saying the various Protestant litanies, deliver us from the hand of Antichrist, the red hand of the Pope of Rome, such things.
Right.
So anyway, 1559, this is the renewal of Henry VIII's royal supremacy, although it's dated 1558 to the beginning of her reign, but it takes place in 1559. So she renews the royal supremacy. She reimposes the Book of Common Prayer of 1551. And then she established fines and punishments to anyone who would not attend the new services. She imposed the death penalty for priests even before the Spanish Armada. So it's usually said, well, with the Spanish Armada, after that, Catholics were looked on as traitors and they had to impose these harsh measures. No, this was already there in 1559.
Right.
And then the entire episcopate, of course, except for one, refused to go along with it, and so they're deprived of their seats, which is the exact opposite of what happened in the time of Henry VIII, right? And so you had to make a special oath of supremacy, the 1559 oath, which you had to take this oath, everyone had to, which would declare in their conscience that the Queen's Highness is the only supreme governor of the realm, that all of her dominions, etc., and you swear to renounce and forsake all foreign jurisdictions and powers, which includes the papacy, right? So, and this was the act of supremacy that had to be sworn. Now, if you refused to, and you refused to attend the Anglican service, you were called a recusate, which is from the Latin word recusare, which means to refuse. You refused to go to the service, and so they so you were fined a few shillings for it, which was expensive, but not impossible, especially if you're middle class. But on the other hand, in 1580, they increased that, and it's still before the Armada. They increased it to £20 for not attending the Anglican service. And that's it. And at that time, anyway, that was a boatload of money. So then, of course, to convert anyone to the Church of Rome is high treason. So if you're trying to evangelize your neighbor, it's high treason. You can be hanged, drawn, and quartered for it.
Or pressed.
Yep, and so then you got the next act, the Jesuits, etc. Act of 1584. So this act commanded all Roman Catholic priests to leave the country in 40 days or they would be punished for high treason, unless within 40 days they swore an oath to obey the Queen. Those who harbored them, and of course obeying the Queen also means becoming Anglican priests.
Right.
Because when they were there, they all protested that, of course, they obeyed the Queen in all things in terms of the civil state, but in the matters of religion, they couldn't do so. But anyway, those who harbored them, that is the priests, the Jesuits, or whoever, and all those who knew of their presence and failed to inform the authorities would be fined and imprisoned. Anyone who became a Jesuit overseas had to return to England within 6 months, and then within 2 days of arriving, swear to submit to the Queen and also take the oath required by the Supremacy Act of 1558, which we already noted. Failure to do that was treason. Any person who did take the oath was forbidden from coming within 10 miles of the Queen for 10 years.
Wow.
Unless they had her personal written position. Again, failure to observe this requirement was treason. So again, too, if you were ever suspected of being Catholic and the Queen was visiting an earl in your town and you lived within 10 miles, you would actually have to get out of your house and go somewhere else until the Queen was gone. Or it would be treasonable. Right? In which, of course, nobody would really note the significance of that, but they could use that against you if they needed to. So, and then it goes further with the draconianness of the penalty. So they had priest hunters. So priest hunters were basically commissioned, sort of deputized in a certain way. They could be any rogues. They could be guys let out of prison for rape and murder and whatever else. But define an acceptable life as priest hunters. If there was a suspicion of a priest living in a house, you would send them in, and they would search the house top to bottom, overturn everything, destroy whatever they felt they needed. And so if they didn't find a priest, you had to pay them for their time. Okay, you had to pay them money, or they'd arrest you. And if they did find a priest there, then of course, they would get a big fat reward from the government, and you would again be arrested and put on trial for high treason for having harbored a priest. So those are the kind of things that Catholics are dealing with. You're being fined. The poorer members are in jail. Some of the more notorious jails, like the Marshalsea or Fleetwood Prison. Interestingly, Fleetwood Prison today is a series of office buildings. It's a prison of another sort. But but anyway, it's so this is the situation that Catholics are dealing with under Elizabeth, and the architects of a lot of it are William Cecil, later his son Robert Cecil, or Cecil, if you're nasty, and Sir Francis Walsingham. And so Walsingham is really important because it comes in with the Venetian connection. And now Venice is important, comes into this interestingly in a couple of ways. One is that so during the time of Queen Mary, there were the English exiles, Protestants who refused to be in England while Mary was queen. So they went abroad, and some of them went to Italy, some of them went to France, and whatnot. So Walsingham went to Italy, and he really enjoyed Italy. He loved the culture, he loved the Catholicism. And he made his way over. Eventually, he was recruited by Venice, and Venice was really interested in recruiting intelligent people and try to foster connections and alliances throughout Europe. So it's a small city-state. Its maritime empire had kind of come to an end because Spain has the province being at the Atlantic, where all the activity is. The Venetians are looking out to the east, where the Turks are. So, their maritime empire is kind of eclipsed. So their diplomacy, secrecy, and espionage, these are the things that are kind of keeping that state alive.
Okay.
And help navigate the Italian wars and whatnot. So they become experts in statecraft and espionage and all these different things. So what they do is they bring in, there's various Englishmen, Italians, French, whatever, that they train in these, and they send them out. Walsingham was one. So Walsingham learns all the tricks that the Venetians had learned over the years, ciphers, how to trap people, how to set up plots. So he goes back to England under Elizabeth, and at first he's kind of ignored for a while until Cecil notices, William Cecil, his talents, and convinces Elizabeth to bring him in. So he's made basically the Secretary of State, or not Secretary of State, that's Cecil. I forget his exact office, but he's basically the founder of MI6.
Okay.
When you get onto it.
Oh, okay.
So he everything he learns from the Venetians, he employs for one. The big thing at the time was finding a way to bring down Mary, Queen of Scots, and that's where that'll never be finally resolved because there's not enough evidence to convict the case absolutely. But for defenders of Mary, Queen of Scots, will argue that the casket letters were a fraud, that this was all set up by Walsingham, and which may very well be true. It just can't be proven absolutely. Any more than certain other things historically. So, but either way, Walsingham was good with it. And so he found people who were rogues, who were down to their luck, who had committed some crimes. Like, okay, we'll set you free if you do some stuff for us. So these guys will come out with a sort of Damocles held over them and go into the Dewey Seminary, pretend you want to be a priesthood, right? It's because the Catholic priests that had left, England, like Thomas Allen and others, they founded a seminary in Dewey. In the Netherlands. And there they were training Catholic clergy principally to go back into England and evangelize it. That's, of course, where the Douay Rheims comes from, Douay Rheims Bible.
Right.
I think for a while they had to withdraw to Rheims where they finished the New Testament. That's why it's called that, Douay Rheims. So, so the English were sending spies that penetrate the the Dewey Seminary, the English Seminary in Rome for Jesuits there as well as for English Catholics. They had two seminaries there. Which were administered by the Jesuits. And so spies are infiltrating all over the place, sent out from Wolsey, and it's usually using people who are desperate, people who just need to pay, who are interested, hey, travel the world, get paid by the government. You get killed later, but you don't know that yet, so have fun. And that's the way a lot of this stuff works. So this is kind of the spy culture that's created. There's a portrait of Queen Elizabeth called the Rainbow Portrait because of the inscription on the left, non sine sole iris. There's no rainbow without the sun, right? And then there's a portrait of Elizabeth there wearing this orange gown, and the gown is covered with eyes and ears, right? And this portrait was copied and put in a number of prominent places. So as a reminder, I can hear everything, I can see everything, because I have spies, and the English archives are full of, payments and records of spies and reports, especially in the north of England, which is where Elizabeth and her government are most terrified of, because London is the main stronghold of Protestants, even throughout Mary's time. And so it's the strongest area of support for Elizabeth. The north of England is almost all Catholic. So for Elizabeth and Cecil and her government, Protestant minority government in a majority English country, that's the terror point. So that's where they're focusing all their work of spies and networking and infiltration. So when the Jesuits first come to England with St. Edmund Campion, and likewise Henry Garnet, John Gerard, Edward Oldcorn, so these great Jesuit martyrs that make their way to England, they have to go in disguise. A lot of times their coming was already known. and because it would slip. There's some spy abroad in Dewey or someone else would get word of them and get even sometimes some accurate descriptions. Hey, these guys are going to look like this, and they're going to come in. So they'd adopt changes of dress, and of course, every once in a while they had networks of people in the country that would come in and speak on their behalf so that the sheriffs would let them go. Other times guys were apprehended right off the bat. So it just depended. So Campion gets into England. He has this marvelous progress through the country. In the end, there's a nobleman that begged for him to come and preach because he was actually ordered by Father Garnet to not, be so public and so obvious. So, but then these people, I can't remember the city, but they begged for him to come back and preach there, and he did. And of course, the spies were there and just happened to catch wind of it, told the authorities, and they came in and grabbed Edmund Campion, which led to his hanging and drawing and quartering.
Which, by the way, in the book, The English Reformation, that I edited, there's an engraving of his execution, translated from the Latin by Ryan Grant. You remember that?
Yes, I do, actually. Thanks for the credit, by the way.
You're very welcome.
So let's get to the meat of where we're getting towards the Gunpowder Plot. So anyway, so all this is going on under Elizabeth. Now, Elizabeth is not married. She has no heirs. And Henry VIII's will had actually stipulated that the Greys should take the throne if Elizabeth died with no issue. But Elizabeth couldn't tolerate that because back in the reign of King Edward, Edward tried to change the succession so that Jane Grey, his cousin, would rule in her heirs male, and that because she was known to be Protestant, and the plan was to capture and kill Mary Tudor and Elizabeth, both of them, and do away with them so that Jane could have the succession and keep it Protestant. Well, that failed. Mary Tudor, won that, which also, ironically, saves Elizabeth too. And the result is that Elizabeth doesn't forget that the Greys tried to snuff her out way back, even though it actually wasn't so much the Greys as it was Edward in his council. But besides that, so she doesn't want them hitting the throne. So she gives Henry VIII's will one last viewing, shuts it up, locks it away, and nobody sees it again for 30 years, so it's kind of forgotten about. And instead, then the Mary Queen of Scots makes her claims, and Elizabeth, again, doesn't want, this is bad, because it means the Catholics can get the throne. But James is more promising, and towards the end of her reign, she was willing to allow her ministers to work that out, as long as she never had to have anything to do with it. So she gave kind of this tacit approval for Robert Cecil to work with James in order to carry out the succession. So James, who is the son of Mary Queen of Scots, and so one who's descended to the Tudors, and then through intermarriage, and then also she married Lord Darnley, who is also related to the Tudors, and so therefore on both sides you have a very strong claim, frankly stronger than Elizabeth's. And then James, he basically has the title, heir, and everything, if the Tudors are legitimate anyway. And
right.
Questions like that, which I'm not going to indulge at the present. So
okay.
So during this time, Robert Cecil is still working on things, and then comes around Robert Devereux. So this is where it gets important. We start bearing on what we're talking about. So Robert Devereux was a nobleman, and he was the son of, or he wasn't the son, he was the successor to the Earl of Dudley, or Robert Dudley, the Earl of Essex, who was Elizabeth's favorite when she was young. So now Devereux, who's younger, succeeds at the same office, and he hopes to have the same favor with Elizabeth. So he's sent to Ireland with a huge force to go confront the Earl of Tyrone, who was revolting against English forces there. And he was expected to have a big victory. It's one of the largest forces sent out since the time of Henry II or something. Devereux ends up not doing very well. In the end, he makes a truce with the Earl of Tyrone and comes back. So he's declared to have deserted of his office. He's stripped of everything, kind of impoverished. He's under house arrest for a while. And so then, at least the official story of the Devereux's, conspiracy at this point has it that he got disgruntled by all this. But there's another side to that, which is that he was concerned for the future of the country, because then, because it's basically in the hands of Robert Cecil, the Lord Secretary of State. He is the successor to his father, William Cecil. He controls all the machinery of state, and he's directing it to his benefit alone, and not that of either the peerage or the people. irrespective of Protestant questions, because Devereux is an Anglican. So Devereux gets on a plot, and it's called the Essex plot, or the Essex revolt.
Okay.
So what they did is it was a combination of things. So they had some people meet without Essex, except that what they didn't realize is Robert Cecil had inherited all the spycraft of Walsingham and used it to great effect. So he already knew that what Essex was plotting something because of some servants who let things that they overheard slip. He knew that he had various people meeting and coming together and trying to affect this plot, this rebellion. So what Essex plans to do, he wasn't trying to overthrow the government. That's one of the classic things that's said. In fact, what he was trying to do is remove Cecil. He's trying to get rid of him, and in place, to get advisors to the Queen that have more of the interest of the people. So a lot of people attached themselves to this plot, as we'll see in a minute, and they. So the plan was, they went to Shakespeare's company at the Globe and asked them to play throughout the weekend the play Richard II.
Okay.
Now, if you know the history of this, it's rather significant. You see what they're trying to do there. So Richard II was one of Shakespeare's most controversial plays. It generally was, so Richard II, historically, he was a monarch also who had counselors, surprise, and of course he was a bit of a gourmand. So he taxed the nobility very heavily so he could have more and great and more delicious food.
Huh.
And he was rather... what's the right word? Despotic, and so eventually he was deposed by Henry Bolingbroke, who became Henry IV, the father of King Henry V. And
now, is Richard II the Richard Longchamps from Braveheart? Was that a different?
No, different one. Well, that was Edward the Longchamp.
Edward the Longchamp.
That was Edward the I.
Okay. So the hammer of the hammer of the Scots, he was nicknamed. Right. Okay.
Exactly.
Okay. So Richard II's after that, right?
A little bit down, because then you have Edward II, and you've got a few in there until you finally get to Richard II. So Richard II is
13th century.
In the end, Henry Bolingbroke, he decides not to actually formally kill Richard II because he's an anointed monarch. It's a sacrilege. So he just locks him up in the tower and doesn't feed him. That's a time starvation.
I heard the story when I was in England. I did.
Right, exactly. So there's a part of the play, Richard II, which actually happens to be one of my favorite plays. Besides that, it's a deposition scene where Henry Bolingbroke is deposing, uncrowning Richard II. And so the play was asked to. So that part of it, the deposition scene, was usually omitted because it was too concerning to the government, and the censors had kind of cut it and said, no, you can't play that. So Devereux's agents asked the Globe Company Shakespeare's company at the Globe to play it with the deposition scene. So they do. And they play it, multiple times over the weekend. And so the plan was for Devereux to raise up a whole bunch of men to demand, to kind of start a revolution, to basically demand the ouster of Cecil from the Secretary of State and everybody associated in his pay. Well, that didn't work out so well, so the people begin materializing, were part of the plot. The majority of the people that were hoped to come didn't show up, and Devereux was late because he couldn't figure out which jacket he wanted to wear for the whole affair. So it was all dispersed by the time he got there. He went back to his estate, and that ended in an armed assault in which he gave himself up eventually. So, and then he was tried again for treason. With about 10 days later, hanged, drawn, and quartered. So that was the end of him. Now, in the Essex plot, there were a number of people caught up. Now, some people only had a tangential connection, so they got fined. Other people were what was it? Like Shakespeare's company got a very harsh warning from the Queen about playing Richard II with the deposition scene, and then there was a whole class of people, basically because there were people marked up further proceedings to be done, and whatnot for the proceedings to happen. And then you get a bunch of people where it says to be used later for the Queen's purpose. Now, this is an interesting list in light of who's going to be involved in the next plot.
Okay.
So these are the people, some of the people, at least the Catholics, amongst a group of others, to be used later for Her Majesty's purpose. Robert Catesby, Thomas Percy, William Parker, otherwise known as Lord Monteagle, Christopher Wright, Francis Tresham, and John Grant, no relation.
Yeah.
So that all of these guys, then, what does it mean to be used for the Queen's purpose? They're fined, they're set loose, but they should be put to death. And especially as they're Catholics, right? And they're known agitators. Thomas Percy's father was put to death by Henry VIII. So for Cecil, reasonably, okay, it seems instead that the purpose he's got in keeping these guys alive, who otherwise he put to death, is to use them as agents provocateurs for a new plot somewhere down the line. And otherwise, their involvement here is inexplicable, right? Because you have this big spy structure. You've penetrated as far as Rome and getting information out of the seminaries in Rome. You're getting all these types of leads on Catholic priests throughout England. Why would you not keep tabs on these guys to be used for your purpose later? It doesn't make any sense. Unless what's happened is he's promised them pardon if they'll do his bidding, which is inform on other Catholics, things that might have been, distasteful. But on the other hand, they're not per se zealots. Their lives do not suggest them as Catholic zealots. So like that movie Treason, Gunpowder Plot, they get Percy all wrong. They also get Catesby wrong. Of course, they suggest this business that he had succumbed to James's homosexuality. James's homosexuality is not established as an absolute fact. It's one of the things that has kind of been taken by historians as a fact because, he makes references that certainly look in that direction. But again, the way men talked to each other in the 16th and 17th centuries did not necessarily imply homosexuality. Very statements that today, like, okay, that just looks like...
Can I tell you that I visited the Houghton House while I was in England? And this is part of the tour that from the gentleman that conducted the tour, Richard. And Richard said exactly what you just said, that it was rumor, but it was never established that James was a randy, as they would have called him. And that the greatest piece of evidence were the writings of the urban legend writings of this guy, I'm trying to remember his name now, who was basically he was a fictionist. He was a storyteller. And he was big buddies with James when he visited Houghton House, and then years later fell out with James and started writing all this book. The only biography I think it was ever written of James was written by this guy, and he's the one that implies it. And the tour guide told us, he goes, this is totally unreliable as a source for James's sexuality. I just thought I'd drop it in because I remember that part of the tour.
Right. And it's true. And too many people have latched onto it with, of course, we do some of it because they wrote the King James Bible, so now we can laugh at that. And things like that and mock Christians for that. Or in other cases, too, it's just the desire to find more historical figures who are gay so we can trumpet them and talk about how great that is. You have that. Now, there's others that are more clear, like William of Orange, who became William the Third of England in the 1688. Now, it's a lot more clear. The evidence is much stronger, especially a note from the English ambassador who was asked as to whether Mary Stuart, who was James II's daughter, when she was married to William, would be able to cope with a man of his interests, and it's said in such a way where, it's a much clearer in that case. But James is really not clear. But anyway, we're getting far afield. So
yes.
Everything in that movie is wrong on those points. So Percy was a guy of loose living, Thomas Percy. So he was a bailiff for the Earl of Northumberland, which meant that he collected rents. The aristocracy in that time, you have to remember, basically has its income from the rents that it collects from his still in the semi-feudal situation. And so Percy's, his job is to collect the rents, which gives him a bit of freedom to move around. for the Earl of Northumberland, because then he's going to be with him when he visits his estates down closer to London or is on some official business. Now, Percy was a bigamist. He had 2 wives. He had a wife in the north and a wife in the south. Doesn't sound like a Catholic fanatic of religious zeal and other things. It actually reminds me of 9/11, where some of the fanatical Islamic terrorists are actually living with pink-haired strippers and snorting cocaine.
Right.
But anyway, not to get bogged down with that. So Percy was a guy, very questionable reputation. Catesby was of uncertain religious devotion and zeal. So you don't have any clear testaments of any desperate love, for the faith. The Wright brothers, less is known about their early life to conjecture. Francis Tresham seems to have been one of the few that had some kind of devout Catholic connection, but he's in the Essex Rising, again, the same thing, with Cecil to be used for his purpose, right? And he had seen firsthand recusancy fines and what they have, because his father was completely financially destroyed by recusancy fines. So, who knows? They may have been promised something by Cecil. We actually don't know. But either way, so all of these guys very likely turned informant, because this is exactly how most people turn informant. They get caught on something, they get officially written down in the government records as to be used for Her Majesty's purpose, and they're set out again. And they wind up in places like Douai, or the Netherlands, or Rome, or France, on these types of missions.
So if you get caught, being any kind of a spy, or any kind of a recusant Catholic or whatever, and you're not put up for execution, or you're not financially ruined with a fine, there's a very good chance, if I'm understanding what the story that you're weaving here, there's a very good chance then that you basically threw in with the English government to assist them in their efforts to find more people like you.
The spy records you can find them in the British Library as well as the Bodleian government records. Payments to spies usually show this.
Okay.
Proceeded against, showed himself useful to His Majesty, etc. They use the old phrases like that basically say they cut a deal.
It makes sense.
Cut off your head,
right?
After we make a mountain of your entrails and hang you for a little bit, but or you could turn on your fellows, and we won't only let you live. We'll reward you.
Well,
wrap you up in the plot and kill you.
In the Showtime miniseries, Elizabeth, this is straight out of whoever the screenwriter was for Elizabeth. This is exactly what she did, and with the guys that were in her court, the legal arm of Elizabeth's reign. I mean, in that miniseries, that this happens often, and then they show you actually. Have you ever seen the miniseries, Elizabeth?
I don't think so.
Okay. There are execution scenes where Catholics are executed, and they show, of course, it's dramatized, not real. I hope it wasn't real, where they show what it looks like when someone is drawn. You don't want to see this. But just imagine a bunch of English people are standing around watching a guy basically get cut with a very sharp fillet knife from his sternum down to his pelvic bone, and then the executioner reaches in, finds a piece of small intestine, pulls it out, and then wraps it around a spindle, and then sets the spindle on fire with oil, pours oil on it, sets the oil on fire, and then turns the spindle so it comes out in front of the guy while he's still alive. This is the drawing part. It's the English were masters of torturing people to death.
It is a gruesome way to go.
It is.
I do have to say, it was called the English call it a fillet knife, because they don't have the American fascination with its fake French pronunciations.
Oh, fillet knife. Okay.
But anyway, that's what they call a fillet knife. But yeah, that's exactly the way they do it. So anyway, so let's move on, because I don't want to run out of time in the middle of this and not be able to get to the conclusion.
Yep. Okay, let's go.
So anyway, so these guys are all now on retention. That's one important backgrounder. The next backgrounder we need to get to is the English regiment in Flanders. And so Flanders, at that time, collectively meant the Netherlands, or in this case, principally that it come to mean the Spanish Netherlands. So that's Belgium, what we today call Belgium, and all the various areas there, whereas the northern part of what used to be called Flanders or the Low Countries, that's what Netherlands means, it became largely, at least in Protestant governance. And so what happened there is the angst against the Spanish had led to a revolt led by William of Orange, the ancestor of the king we mentioned a little bit ago, William III. Is also called William the Silent, which is based on some phony history. But anyway, but he has that name, William the Silent. So he had led this revolt against the King of Spain in the northern parts of Holland, and they had formed the United Provinces, right? And so that became, the Dutch Republic. So they had fought against Spain for a long time. It's called the 80 Years' War. It basically starts in this period. It has a short truce in it. But, and so all these countries, Friesland, Drenthe, Zeeland, Utrecht, they become Protestants. And so the Catholics in Spain, so of course in the Flanders, they don't like the Spanish all that much either, but they're more trying to hold on to their Catholic faith a little stronger. So areas like Brussels, Liège, Mechlin, Breda, the Brabant, et cetera, places like that. So these places remain, for the most part, staunchly Catholic, although there is still a lot of commerce and trade between the two, for the most part. Antwerp, which was the major capital of it all, they get shut down by a Dutch blockade. But anyway, so the Catholic side is recruiting mercenaries, and they come from all over. They come from Ireland. They come from England. So, the Spanish had early on recognized Catholic exiles from England will make great soldiers if the pay is right. And so sometimes you see Catholic soldier, Catholic English fighting on the Protestant side because the pay was better at that time, and switch, right, because it's not always necessarily a very strong religious affiliation. Sometimes it's just where the money's at. Other times you'll see a Protestant fighting an English Protestant fighting on the Spanish side, again, because the money was better at that time, or who knows. But in this, the Spanish forces fighting in Flanders was an English regiment that was headed by an Irish Colonel William Stanley. And so Stanley is more or less, he's the predecessor of Guy Fawkes in Flanders. And a lot of people don't realize this. And when Guy Fawkes fought for the Spanish, he was fighting in Flanders as part of a very specific English regiment that was all recruited by the Spanish, because they found that units that work together instead of being mixed up with other soldiers whose language they don't necessarily speak tend to function better. So Stanley was a very good leader of this particular regiment. They'd been used very effectively, and so the king had kept this regiment. Now, it was illegal for Englishmen to join the English regiment, okay? And that's one of the important things that often gets forgotten, is that James comes to the throne in 1603 after Elizabeth's death. Now, James had a lot of various political notions that would probably be interesting to talk about. We just don't have the time. The principal one is that he believed in absolute monarchy as we understand that today, which is different from the more traditional medieval monarchy of a king limited by tradition and law. And, I mean, although Henry VIII and Elizabeth are very much that type of monarch too, they understand the kind of the political necessity of engaging the nation through the nobles, through Parliament, and making it making Parliament look like it actually has a job there.
On last Wednesday's my interview with Brother Andre Marie, we brought this up because somebody was throwing the canard out that the Catholics invented the divine right of kings. And I asked Brother Andre to explain it, and of course he shot it down, and he said, medieval kings, as you just pointed out, Ryan Grant, by the way, is our special guest here on Guy Fawkes Day, learning the real story of the Gunpowder Plot here on the Mike Church Show. As Brother Andre Marie pointed out in last Wednesday's interview, which you could hear at crusadechannel.com, kings of the monarchs of the medieval age had a lot to deal with. They had barons, where they were. They had nobles to deal with, and they respected them. Brother even said there were instances where guilds would meet, and the king wanted to attend the meeting, and the guilds would say, "No, you can't. You're not a member." So it wasn't this, I am the king, and my rule is absolute. This actually comes after, as Ryan is describing here, this form of monarchy, if it is practiced, comes after the age of faith and during the what we call today the Enlightenment.
And now, the Crusade Channel's On Demand presents the Mike Church Show's The 5th of November, the real Guy Fawkes story revealed, featuring historian Ryan Grant.
So it was illegal now for Catholics to join the Irish regiment.
Okay.
English Catholics to join the English regiment in Flanders, headed up by this Irishman. Now, that changes a little bit when James comes to the throne. So James comes in again in 1603. He is the King of Scotland. So he's James the Sixth of Scotland, and he becomes James the First of England. So he's technically the monarch of two countries that are also at the very same time at war with each other. So
imagine that.
Kind of establish a peace there, and that actually becomes a very hard thing for him to manage. But on the other hand, his goal is to be peace. He styles himself a prince of peace. Okay, and so he tries to effect that by making peace with France and Spain, whom England had been at war with, and also to stop backing the Protestants in the Netherlands, and so as to effect peace. So we're not going to be at war with Spain. That means we're not going to be fighting against them in the Netherlands. So being at a state of peace with Spain opens up the way for English Catholics, English exiles or whatever, to go and join the English regiment in Flanders if they want. And legally they can do it because they're not countenancing England's enemies, because England is no longer an enemy to Spain. So for Cecil, this is a huge problem. It dawns on him fairly early. If an effective English regiment is able to rise in Flanders, you have Englishmen of dubious loyalty to the crown, being mostly Catholic, that are well-trained and supplied militarily, who could just make the jump across the channel and effect a revolution against the government. So that was something that was hugely problematic. Then you have Guy Fawkes. And where does Fawkes come in? So Guy Fawkes, who will be in this discussion later, so he is a Catholic, and through his stepfather, who brought the family to Catholicism and back to Catholicism. And Fawkes was raised, seems very pious and whatnot, and he leaves England looking for better opportunity. And so then he ends up, while he's traveling, meeting agents working for William Stanley who were recruiting, and he becomes a member of the English regiment in service of the Spanish. And that's where, of course, as the story goes, and it's not wrong, he gets a reputation for being a gunpowder expert. He's very good at working with cannon. He improves, actually, some developments to cannon at that time. He also becomes an expert at exploding walls with gunpowder and other things. So he knows scientifically how gunpowder is supposed to work, how, in the way it works, by the way, so just to understand, like, the idea of making a gunpowder bomb is when you group all these barrels of gunpowder together, if you're like, well, only one of them goes off, what's that going to do? What happens is the heat and the kinetic energy builds and explodes that barrel, and it creates a chain reaction in turn, which is only seconds off in all the rest of the barrels, because the heat and the pressure from the explosion causes that same rise in the kinetic energy. And that's how you can get a massive explosion if you have stacked them all correctly.
Okay.
And now this idea was, of course, no, it's interesting. In the records of the Venetian Republic, there's actually a reference to somebody advising the Venetian Senate that we need to secure the undercroft of the Senate building here, because any traitor to the state could amass gunpowder down there and blow it up. And this was a note written in about the 1590s. Now, this is something that because there's a trading too, and one of the you see a trade of information between Venice and England. It's a very strange connection between the two, and that kind of continues. Like, for example, in 1605 during the Venetian interdict, the English are championing the Venetians as these great fighters against popery, and even some popes or some people in Venice, like Paolo Sarpi and people like that, they're really hoping for like a union with England in opposition to the papacy. which in the end, though, he just couldn't accept Protestant doctrines, and he decided that he couldn't jump these steps, even though he was a dubious Orthodox. So he barely ever said Mass. As soon as the Pope put him under interdict, he's not supposed to say Mass. He said it every day, Paul Sarpi. So, but, so it seems unlikely that Cecil would never have heard of this idea. And you look at the peculiarity of what the Gunpowder Plot is supposed to be. It's that very same idea, amassing all this gunpowder underneath the Parliament and then blowing it up. But anyway, so Fawkes is abroad working for the Spanish as a soldier, essentially. And so that's kind of where he is at the time at this plot basically begins. So the next key in the whole thing is the Jesuits in England. So we mentioned them a little earlier. The Jesuits were most feared by the English. And it's one of those very odd things. We talked about this a little bit in our conversation about St. Robert Bellarmine. And one of the reasons that his name comes down to his anglicized with a Bellarmine, and he doesn't keep his O like Galileo and others, is because it was properly Bellarmino, is because the English feared his writing so much and they started making use of it that, the Anglicization of his name just stuck. Whereas that never happened with Galileo, more until recently. I see him try to say Galileo Galilei or something like that. I don't know. But they try to change his monkey around his first name a little bit. But so anyway, Bellarmine's this, fixture in the English imagination is like a gargoyle on their ecclesiastical landscape. And the Jesuits at large are. So the fact that Jesuits are coming into England, this is the first wave of Antichrist coming in, right? So it's really terrifying to them, actually. So the goal of Robert Cecil, which he inherits from his father, is to break the back of the Jesuits in England. Now, Catholics are generally held to be of good morals and seem to be of good lives, and so they have high respect of all. And the Jesuits, even Protestants who had dealt with them in England, had to say, these guys are a blameless and upright life. Can't say the same about some of our clergymen. And so this was something that was getting to the government. And even as James has taken over, it's still a problem. You got the Jesuits. So they're in England, but the government doesn't know where. And we should add, there's a Jesuit lay brother, it's Saint Nicholas Owen. And he's actually very famous because he's also a carpenter. So he made what were called priest holes. And he would cut, he learned this technique because he was a joiner. But you have a carpenter, and you have a joiner. A carpenter at this time is basically a guy who just cuts the wood, maybe shaves down into planks and things like that, puts a nail into something. That's a carpenter. But a joiner, he's the guy that makes it look nice. He learns all the secrets of the trade and everything. So Nicholas Owen was apprenticed as a joiner, and he ends up developing the system of creating priest holes. And he learned very quickly to make them all unique, don't make them the same, so that if the priest hunters discover the secrets of how one of them worked, they don't find them all. Right, and so Owen, and of course he'd been in almost every Catholic house in England. He's the guy who's key to breaking the back of Catholic England. And the authorities don't know it. They even arrest him a couple of times and he goes away with a fine. They don't know his importance because he's very good about keeping silent and enduring torture. So,
Ryan, have you ever seen a priest hole?
Only in pictures, because I've never actually been to England myself.
Okay, I've been to England and I saw a priest hole. You might as well call it a midget hole. You would not want to have to, and they said, because they had one in the Houghton House and one of the other houses we toured, they even said that these priest hunter dudes, these guys, because they weren't going to get paid unless they found a priest, that they would sit there and they would go in a house and they wouldn't leave for like a whole weekend or however long it would take to wait out the priest because he's in there crouching and cramped, and of course he's got to pee or he's got to go to the bathroom or whatever. Ultimately, the way they got many of them is they waited them out. They just waited them out, and the door, the hole would open up, the secret compartment or whatever, and they, of course, would expose the priest, and then they would get their bounty. So I just wanted to throw that in.
Sometimes they weren't able to wait them out. Sometimes they just gave up or thought they were wasting their time. And usually they'd only wait them out if they found one priest hole in the house, even if nobody was in it, because there were multiple ones in a lot of houses. If they found one, they knew there had to be more, so they would just hang out. But if they didn't find anything like that, then they'd just sit by. But Owen will come into the story, too, actually, a little bit in the end. So this is why the Jesuits are the most feared group by the by the Protestant government as such. Right, and so the superior of the Jesuits this time is Henry Garnet, and he'll come into the story as well. So what essentially happens is that, so you have the official story is you got a handful of guys who are desperate men, and they decide they need to do something about the plight of Catholics in England, and so they come together and make up a plot to blow up Parliament while the king is in it. So now what's going to happen is James needed money. The possessions, a lot of the crown possessions gained by Henry VIII in the suppression of the monasteries, well, they had been frittered away, and Elizabeth had given a lot of crown lands away to her favorites. She had further debased the coinage and undid a lot of the financial reforms being done under Mary I, for example. And the one she gets credit for are things that she actually continued from Mary that came to fruition. So the finances of the exchequer are in sorry state, and this is, of course, one of the reasons why, if James did in fact promise toleration for Catholics, he wasn't going to do it because he's seeing how much money comes in from recusants finds, and he needs it real bad. So he's going to Parliament on the 5th of November, 1605, in order to basically demand money out of Parliament. It's another factor that comes into this. And lastly, his making peace with France and Spain has also made the English gentry upset with him and less amenable to giving him a forced loan of any kind or money, because a lot of them had investments into gunpowder production, and into companies that dealt in military traffic. And now that there's no war, there's really no need for gunpowder. So a lot of the gunpowder goes in the open market, and the stocks go down. So a lot of these guys, including Cecil, are going to lose money. So all of that comes into the hashing of the plot. And so I already mentioned Thomas Percy, who's very dubious of the character morally, serves the Earl of Northumberland, who's also on he's not on Cecil's Christmas card list, to put it that way. And,
okay.
And so then you get Catesby, Robert Catesby, who's usually taken to be the grand arbiter of the whole plot. In actuality, when you get into the evidence, he stands kind of in pales in comparison to Percy, who's really the mover and shaker of the whole thing. So Catesby is a widower. His wife had died while he was in prison for the Essex plot. So remember, all the guys I'm mentioning now, they were all Essex plotters. And so he's in and out of Catholic circles all of a sudden with kind of a renewed interest, because he'd really shown up now. And also he makes the acquaintance of Henry Garnet. And it's at this time that he works, it's said anyway, officially, that he's working with Percy and kind of leading along. And really it's the other way around, as I mentioned. But so they start leading other Catholics into this plan. This is in the beginnings of 1605. And once the proclamation of the Parliament is given, that's when all of a sudden this plot starts to come about. What if we could do away with him and the Parliament, take over the country, is the thought.
By the way, the plot sounds just totally ludicrous to anyone that looks at it going back.
Especially when all these guys would normally be constantly watched by the government. And if they weren't being constantly watched, it would be because Cecil had ordered them to not be watched. And the idea that he's not watching any of these guys just because, when they're all caught in a plot against Elizabeth, and so for the next couple of years, I mean, he was the same guy. Cecil was already there during the Essex plot. So it's not like he had a change in management and paperwork got lost somewhere.
A change in management.
Right? So that didn't happen. And so why are these guys not being watched? And now, so the only non-Essex plotter that gets brought amongst the first group, who I mentioned previously, Thomas Percy, Robert Catesby, William Parker, Lord Monteagle, he was part of this group too, and it's referenced in various letters that are in the state archives, to be meeting at this time frequently with Percy and Catesby, because the official story is that an anonymous letter was sent to Lord Monteagle, that is William Parker, to stay away from Parliament lest it receive a great blow. And so while Cecil was confused over the meaning of this, he sees a light, James sees a light from heaven and realizes that they're going to blow it up with gunpowder, of course. And
This is ludicrous.
And it's ludicrous, too, because Monteagle he lives quite a ways away. And the weather reports from that time show it was rainy and muddy. A lot of the roads would have been impassable. The idea that Monteagle could have gotten the letter on the 4th and arrived there on the 4th of the same day, when that's a 3-day trip, is absurd. But, it's a case of Cecil being too clever in his crafting of the government narrative, because he needed to show urgency in action. But if the letter's given to Monteagle on the 1st, when it's actually, been composed, right, or supposed to have been composed, you weren't acting fast enough. And so that's one of the things that they do. Of course, in all likelihood, there's actually handwriting experts that have determined that the handwriting of the Monteagle letter, which is still in the English archives, is actually Robert Cecil's, just looking at his other stuff. So he actually himself wrote the letter. In those days, they didn't have handwriting experts.
They wouldn't have had handwriting analyst or CSI or any of those things back then, right?
So this is one of the things that goes into it. So William Parker, of course, again, he was let go for the use of Her Majesty's purpose at £4,000 during the Essex plot. So here he is playing his role on both sides of it. So the main goal, again, like we said, is to bring in the Jesuits. So as the plot widens, these guys have to start seeking out an expert to deal with the gunpowder. And so they start seeking abroad, specifically in Flanders. Now, I'm sure you could have come up with somebody locally that would have, had known something about gunpowder, or could have put it together. And really, Cecil could have supplied it. I keep mixing up the American versus British pronunciations of his name. I apologize to British listeners. Cecil could have found, anyone to work gunpowder, but they looked very specifically in Flanders, that is the plotters, Caspian, Percy and Winters and Wright and whatnot. They looked very specifically in Flanders for a gunpowder expert. Why in Flanders? Actually, it doesn't make any sense, because you could easily find someone in England that would attract less attention. Especially if you're going to bring somebody back who fought for the Spanish, that would raise government, attention normally. So, but they do, and agents bring Guy Fawkes back, and so now the official story is that Fawkes, being a zealous, fighter for the Catholic faith, comes back with this great desire to carry out this terrorist act to blow up the king and the government and whatnot. But at the same time, Fawkes there's no direct evidence showing that, except for his confession, which only appears after his torture so terribly his name is all like chicken scratch. You can barely write it anymore. So Fawkes is brought in kind of as the gunpowder expert. And according to the official narrative, the cover is he's recruiting men for the English regiment in Flanders. What if that's not the cover? What if Fawkes is really the sheep-tip patsy, your Oswald, if you will, that's kind of being put out there as the guy? So we'll kind of see how that unfolds as we go along. So our main conspirators, the main body of conspirators, start acquiring gunpowder, right, and start bringing it in slowly. Now, they go over to Parliament. Now, so the official narrative has them digging this mine to hit Parliament diagonally from outside. The Parliament buildings in Westminster is no longer there anymore. It was taken down in the 19th century. It was demolished. So the way it worked then is that there was big undercroft underneath the Abbey where Parliament met, and that's where the gunpowder is supposed to be stored. So they try to do it through a mine. So dig a tunnel from diagonally from the outside, which magically nobody heard them, nobody saw the dirt, right? But anyway, so they dug this tunnel supposedly and thought they could, punch through it. And at some point they said, "Oh, wait a minute, this is actually not a good idea. So we better rent the buildings under here, a section of the buildings under Parliament," which many people did, and that'll be so much easier. When I give them my name, they won't freak out, even though I was involved in the Essex plot and I'm a known Catholic activist.
So I'm a Catholic activist in Protestant England. The only reason that I'm alive is because I probably turned some kind of state's evidence on other Catholics, and I am known to the state. Elizabeth has a gown that's in the rainbow painting that has eyes and ears on it, symbolizing that, hey, I am watching you clowns at all times. And we're supposed to believe that the English authorities, who knew all of these men, did not watch them. Not only did they not watch them, but they allowed them to rent the room directly beneath where the Parliament was going to meet, and where on this particular day, the king was supposed to appear, wasn't he?
Well, eventually, and then not on the very day that Percy rented it, but very soon, because he started. When did he rent the room? Believe, unless I'm mistaken, he rented the room in June or July. So it's only we're less than 6 months into when the king is going to be meeting there, and nobody notices. So now Goodman, who is a servant of the Duke of Norfolk, and the Duke of Norfolk is who Percy works for, and that's Northumberland. The Duke of Norfolk, though, was singled out for singular hatred by Cecil. But so Goodman, who is a servant, he looks at this whole thing, this whole claim about digging a mine into the Parliament where there's no dirt and but there's a hole sitting there, probably for some kind of work. And he says, how could men believe that such a small digging was to the purpose of establishing a tunnel when they could so easily rent a room? And so he was a contemporary witness to this whole thing, and he's questioning this business because it just doesn't make any sense. Well, it's a case of Cecil being too clever to try to cut down on incredulity about the government story. It's like, look, and you could see the tunnel they tried to dig when it could just be any particular hole there for any reason, right? And so the next thing that's really indicative, and I think it's the main evidence in this whole thing for why this was actually state-sponsored terror rather than a plot by Catholics to destroy the government, is that Cecil gave them a bomb that wouldn't work. Or Percy, or I don't know whose touch that was. But, of course, you needed to make sure. What if there was an accident, right? It was dangerous stuff. And if James sees this plot, or if it's according to the more accepted narrative that Cecil saw the plot and allowed it to widen, right? Is James really going to be comfortable with the fact that Cecil allowed a real potential bomb to be placed in Parliament? Well, no. So in 1978, 4th May 1978, the London Telegraph reported the discovery of a receipt for Fawkes' gunpowder on 7th November 1605. So this is the lieutenant of the Tower. He's given his receipt. Breathed into His Majesty's store within the office of the ordnance from out of the vault underneath the Parliament House, corn powder, 1,800 weight, decayed, which was there laid and placed for the blowing up of the said house in destruction of the King's Majesty in nobility and commonalty there assembled. Received as aforesaid corn powder, decayed, crows of iron with round pommels or heads too. All right, so to unpack this, we first talking about corn powder.
Corn powder, not gunpowder, corn powder.
What's corn powder? Now, so the way you make gunpowder in those days is you had your mix, obviously, of nitrate, saltpeter, etc., and you'd put this together. Your chemists out there will know the exact recipe. I forget which elements off the top of my head.
TNT is what the abbreviation is.
Put it together. And then, you get this explosion. But then they found that if they soaked the powder and dried it and ground it down, you would have a much more powerful powder, okay? And so that was, so it was much more work doing that. You involved a lot more chemicals and things. And so, making that was a little more expensive. If you wanted to train someone in the use of a musket, remember the muskets at that time was what we call the matchlock, okay, or the arquebus. And the way the matchlock worked is, if you think of a flintlock from Revolutionary times, right? But now take out the flint, and instead you have this mechanism that's connected to the trigger that you attach a burning match to, and the match was a bit of rope that was soaked in saltpeter. So you would get that thing burning, and you'd connect it to a holder on the front of the barrel, and then you would open up your primer pan, dump your primer in, but then you would load the ball in the gunpowder. It's kind of like you see in Civil War muskets. But then you would then move yourself to half cock. When you took aim to shoot, you went full cock, so you pull the trigger. The trigger then, you should have to reattach the match to the trigger mechanism. Pull the trigger puts the match into the pan. You see this flash. If you've ever shot one of these and for the first time, you didn't know what it's going to do. You see the flash and nothing happens.
Mm-hmm.
And you're like, wait a minute. And this happened to me, actually, the first time I shot one. And then it went off, and I wasn't expecting it. It almost was not a good, it was very much in need of a bathroom. I wasn't expecting it. It scared the crap out of me. So you need training like that, because it'll flash, and you have to sit there on target
and wait
for the explosion, because the explosion inside the barrel might just be off a little bit by a few seconds from the flash. Usually the flash and instantaneous boom, it actually doesn't necessarily happen. So the reaction might take longer, but I guess the same principle we talked about earlier. The kinetic energy heats up, explodes, pushes that ball out the barrel, and hopefully, if you're lucky, into the other man. Of course, they're wildly inaccurate compared to the flintlock or the Kentucky rifle and such things. But nevertheless, so you need a lot of training to hone your skills and get this right. And usually, troops of this sort are going to be used in conjunction with men carrying pikes and cavalry with swords and pistols. And so that's usually the purpose. You're not seeing full-out infantry armed only with a rifle until approximately the War of the First Coalition, the War of Spanish Succession. It's the first time you see armies moving around with just guns, and there's no infantry that armed with just like pikes and swords and whatnot.
Right.
So, but anyway, that's the future. So you need a lot of training. So corn powder is a less expensive, less quality training that hones in these particular skills. And it decays faster than gunpowder, which will keep in barrels for quite a bit longer. So the corn powder is noted by the lieutenant of the Tower of London as being decayed. Decayed gunpowder does not light. You can ask anybody who reloads weapons, reloads bullets and stuff that works with gunpowder. It does not burn and blow up. So if all these barrels of gunpowder, 1,800 weight, decayed, they're all decayed, there was never any chance of any bomb ever going off. So that raises more questions. So Fawkes is this gunpowder expert from Flanders, from the Spanish army. He's got these great appraisals from the Spanish army, and he doesn't know that he's sitting with decayed gunpowder. That's rather absurd. It really doesn't work. What if he hadn't seen it? Or he's only seen a couple barrels that have real gunpowder and the rest of it doesn't? What if he actually thinks he's sitting there underneath the Parliament, guarding gunpowder that's meant to be sent to the English regiment, which Percy has been employing him to recruit for? What if that's what's going on with this gunpowder in Fawkes, and he's not there for the purposes of blowing up Parliament? And that's a really interesting theory. And so, like I said, Father Edwards, in his book, The Enigma of the Gunpowder Plot, 1605, is one of the best things. He's got all the documentary, copious footnotes to which are all going back to state papers just about. So, so again, it really makes this case very strong. It's not mere conspiracy theory now. There's a lot of evidence behind it that makes it rather plausible.
So the case is that the plot to use whatever is in these barrels to actually blow the Parliament up is just, as we've been saying, it doesn't pass the smell test. It's ridiculous. However, there is a conceivable use for the powder, and that the historical record and common sense would support that. You could say, okay, well, yeah, I could see that he would that you would have the powder and you would have it here for this. And the other part about it, in the barrel of gunpowder, it is kind of like what you see on the Looney Tunes. On the when the Wile E. Coyote is going to try to blow up the Roadrunner. It is a wooden barrel, and when you fill a wooden barrel like this up, you got to remember too that a barrel of this size has a considerable amount of weight to it as well.
Right.
So you're not talking about something you could just waltz into Parliament. We just can't just roll barrels that weigh 600 pounds apiece.
Now, on the other hand, people, defenders of the second view, will say, well, Parliament wasn't as busy as it is today, and the Parliament was not continually meeting. It would meet at appointed times, such as this one, and so you could, other people rented and stored things there to be shipped out later, and so it wasn't inconceivable this could be done without attracting too much notice. Yes and no. On the one hand, it's true. Not like, you could never sneak anything into Parliament today. You couldn't sneak a ham sandwich into Parliament today without getting approval by somebody.
Nope.
But in those times, so it's true, you don't have anyone watching, but you still need to have an accounting of business. There's still inspections at different times, mostly to see that goods are legal and have their duties paid or taxes properly paid on them, principally is the reason. So we've got, according to, again, the official story, all this gunpowder's been piled up there, and then various diverse iron bars and other things are being placed all over it to make it look like, kind of a ramshackle of things, so nobody will think to come inspect too closely. And, and that doesn't really make sense, because people will still come by to see that dues have been paid, unless they've been told not to. And that's because you basically have a government rentable warehouse. Government's going to come down and make sure you're paying your taxes. So, again, it doesn't seem to really work. But anyway, so we know that the night of 4th November, 1605, after we mentioned the inconsistency of the Monteagle letter, William Parker, and that Parker was an Essex plotter who had been let go for Her Majesty's use at the time, Her Majesty, now his, and so he's cooperating fully with Cecil, sends this letter that's supposedly written that graphologists have shown was actually Cecil's hand, writing this great warning, right? So now on the acting on the Monteagle letter, they've searched on the 4th of November the Houses of Parliament and find one man identifying himself as John Johnson. And now, believe it or not, that sounds hokey to us, but at the time there were plenty of people with names like that, and sometimes a double-up name, Fred Frederickson, right? It had a ring to it that people at that time liked. So that's not so unbelievable and ridiculous. And it's identifying himself as Mr. Percy's man. And upon inspection, according to the narrative, is said to have been carrying a match, having there a lantern, and other things. Now, there's a note that survives sent from Percy asking Fawkes to investigate or to have a look at the gunpowder. Right. So, every night to inspect it in the next couple of nights. So he's doing that, right? And then that's when he's apprehended. And allegedly with a match. Now, there's no evidence of the match. There's no record of it being put in his things in the tower. There is, reference to it in the confession, which we'll get to at the end of this. So, but there's nobody's seen it. Right, the way that it's shown in all the engravings and the woodcuts and things like that. So it's one of those curious things. So he's not reported directly to have had the match, but the later reports are kind of edited to add that back in. So it's a point of confusion. Then you come to so he's arrested and taken to the tower, and then and likewise with all this, corn powder, gunpowder, and at the same time the orders come down to arrest Mr. Percy, Mr. Caspi, Thomas Winters. Now, Thomas Winters may be another guy that wasn't actually directly connected to the plot. I thought he was working to raise troops for the English regiment. And, and that part's hard to get alleged then with Fawkes, but it's still possible, right? But anyway, and then you also include the Wright brothers and John Grant, again, the relation, and a few others that, are abroad in the country, and they end up at Holbeach. And so now the official story is that Fawkes was supposed to blow up the Parliament, and afterwards Percy and Caspi would raise an army and declare for and take King James's daughter Elizabeth and have her put on the throne, kind of under their with them or other Catholics as like a ruling council. And that's the official narrative. In actuality, what you see happen is that they're moving very quickly, and Catesby, according to all the witnesses, stays very close to Percy, because at that point he was convinced that Percy was the one who was marked to survive all this, And he better stick with Percy. That was his only chance of surviving. And so during the fight at Holbeach, so what happens is the sheriffs in Holbeach is one of the Midland counties, and the sheriff, catches wind of them, and he gets on their trail. He finds them holed up at a house in a place called Holbeach in the state there. So there's a fight that ensues, although in the midst of it, here's a funny thing that happens. While all the men are sleeping, the roof and the windows are blown out because their gunpowder is accidentally set off by Percy. How does Percy destroy most of their gunpowder weapons? It doesn't really add up. Just by accident, really? These guys are so inexperienced with their plotting to do all this, they can't actually make their gunpowder work. Again, there's something that's just off there. That just looks very odd. It's inexplicable otherwise, unless, again, he thinks he's fulfilling Cecil's orders. And then immediately when the sheriffs come in, they are the only ones who are shot dead, Percy and Catesby, because they're the men who know too much. Right now, there's documentation in the English archives that some of Lord Salisbury's servants, that is Cecil's servants, they say that I saw my lord meeting with a certain Thomas Percy and others, and this is in August and September of 1605, leading up again to the plot. So you have eyewitness testimonies in the English archives of Cecil having met with Percy. So it looks very much like these are the guys who know too much. So Winters and several of the others, the Wright brothers and others, they're taken in probably because they don't know nearly as much. Now, another one ensnared in this whole business is Father Henry Garnet. So he is the superior of the Jesuits in England. And so what happened is Catesby, at some point in the summer, asks very urgently to see Father Garnet to go to confession. And in the course of the confession, as Father Garnet revealed later under questioning, Catesby had revealed to him the plot to blow up England. Now, he did it only in the confessional, refused to speak of it outside the confession. And again, now what's the purpose of this? Why are you going to tell the priest about the plot?
Why is the priest going to tell anyone else?
Well, he's not. That's just it. That's part of the problem. So, and this is part of the problem with the English authorities. Well, you knew about the plot, and you didn't tell anybody. I couldn't. I heard it in confession. And so it was for this reason that Father Henry Garnet was executed for high treason, because he failed to report knowledge of this plot, so he might as well be accounted as an accomplice. And he explained that, I couldn't. Mr. Catesby said I could only reveal it if, to save myself if it came under questioning. But he wasn't allowed to. All right. So that, so this was a purposeful thing to implicate the Jesuits, essentially. And because if it's just a question of these guys came together and decided to blow up Parliament, so why are you going to involve the priest?
Right. Why do you
think he's got something he can give you?
Well, then the other thing is, as I'm listening to this, there is, if you have some kind of knowledge of the seal of the confessional, as I believe that it's called, priests are not going to reveal what they hear in a confession. This is developed early. If you get Father Slattery's book, Heroism and Genius, he actually explains that it's the Irish priests that began this in like the 6th and 7th century. That priests are known to operate in the confessional, and what we call the confessional today, under the seal of the confessional. They're not going to reveal what it is that you confess to them in the confessional. That is between the priest and the penitent, and they're also not going to reveal what they gave you as a punishment. So anyone that knows anything about how an actual confession goes has to look at what you just said and what the official version of this is. And if you're a Catholic and you know how confession works, you have to scoff at this and go like, but that's not how it works. Obviously, someone that has little knowledge of this or is contemptuous of the knowledge may fabricate something like that and go like, well, this is how it came about. So that's what it sounds like to me anyways.
Right. And it does. And so the only purpose for this is that, especially that, well, if you're ever questioned about it, you can tell someone. And giving him that explicit permission to say something in that event is that, that Father Garnet's conscience would be burdened. And as a result, under questioning, he would have to admit it since he was given that free leave to say so, and he could no longer refuse to answer on grounds of the seal of confession because he was explicitly given permission by the penitent to say so under such circumstances, which you can do, actually. It's just like if a priest is ever accused of having done a certain thing in the confession, he can't say anything about it, or it's like said something that was heretical or bad. So the penitent actually has to give him leave in order to reveal the details of the confession.
Sure.
And, I mean, technically the Pope has the power to. There's no case in which that ever happened that I'm aware of. But anyway, beside that. So Garnet is kind of stuck in a situation. He has to watch in the ensuing months of July, August, September, October, leading up to this plot, knowing what's going to happen, and knowing all the people that Catesby, Percy, and Francis Tresham is another person I haven't mentioned too much because I just don't have time to get into his narrative. But, these people have mentioned up and down all the different things going on with, these people have seen, all the things they're recruiting people, they're making arrangements, and Garnet's watching this happen right under his nose, and the danger that this is going to have, to the Catholic community in England, he can't do anything about it. But that was rather the intention. So anyway, so Garnet, after all these guys are taken to the Tower and tortured. So at first, Guy Fawkes, all right, basically he's described by the lieutenant. The lieutenant of the Tower at the time was Sir William Wade. His name is spelled W-A-A-D, like Wad, but it's pronounced Wade. So Wade was there in the Tower to replace previous lieutenants who were far more easygoing, especially on Catholic prisoners, didn't like that they were there, thought it was unjust. So Wade comes in to clean up and put in discipline, and he's put in there by Cecil in July of 1605, and to tighten up all the discipline of the Tower, make sure people can't come and go, bribe their way out of their cells and whatnot. And all of this is in place just in time.
Just in time.
Just
in the nick of time.
Yep, for these new inmates. And so now Fawkes is brought in there, and at first eventually he does admit his true name under questioning because they already knew it, and then it explains himself that he was Mr. Percy's servant who was sent to govern a store of gunpowder meant for Flanders. And he wouldn't give any more than that because he was afraid of the authorities, because even though it wasn't illegal anymore, they wouldn't look kindly on bringing gunpowder for a regiment out of the country into Flanders. So he kind of keeps, certain details to himself. So then he's sent for a few rounds of torture, and he still kind of sticks to that story. But after he got unbearable, you see now on the new November 8th testimony of Fawkes, of course, he doesn't write it. He signed it, and it's chicken scratch. It's barely recognizable. The signature after torture. And that used to be put on pamphlets to kind of show people, see what he got. That's what everyone can expect. Look how bad his signature is now. He must have got it real bad, torture-wise. So ultimately, so that's one of the first things. So he ends up confessing to being a part of this whole plot. And then the story changes a couple times, basically, as Cecil decides to add little more details to the whole thing. And then you get Thomas Winters. Okay, now in all of his physical writings, he spells his name Wintors, W-I-N-T-O-U-R-S. Now in English, in spelling at that time, you could spell a lot of words in diverse ways. And you could words coming from Latin or from French. You might write them how you hear them. You might write them by some way you've seen them spelled, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's wide diversity in that. But when it came to your name, well, everybody spells their name in exactly the same way. And Winter's name is spelled in his confession W-I-N-T-E-R-S. Whereas he always spelled it W-I-N-T-O-U-R-S in all of his documents. So again, you have a forged signature. and to confessing to these various areas of knowledge of the plot. And then as the torture continues, names start appearing, especially Jesuits. It's how Henry Garnett's name gets on the authorities list, and they do find him. Father John Gerard is alleged to have administered the oath, excuse me, that all the plotters took to carry out this terrorist act. Okay? If you can find it, his book, Autobiography of a Hunted Priest, for example, he talks a little bit about this stuff and the torture he endured at different times when he was caught. You have other figures make prominent Catholic noblemen, right, where they met. And so anyway, so when the priest hunters were in one particular house, I think it was, what was the name? Abington, I think, was the name of the particular Catholic peer. And so the priest hunters were in his house for days. Now, of course, it happened that this was before Garnett was captured, but Garnett was hiding there. Father Gerard was hiding there. 2 other Jesuit priests were in the priest holes, and so was Nicholas Owen and another lay brother. So Nicholas Owen, like we said, is the key to all of Catholic England. He has been in every house. He has constructed holes, priest holes in every house. Okay, and so he's arrested, and this time Cecil figures out who Owen is and why he's important, and he realizes now that Owen is the key. And so they set all the torture that they can upon Nicholas Owen, from the rack to torturously cutting him and putting vinegar and salt in the wounds. They put him in the thumb screws. They tear out fingernails. They leave him hanging by a chain by his hands for days and days at a time. He won't talk. His lips are sealed. And so in the end, Owen, all this torture was contrary to law, actually. The only crime they had him on is they found him concealed in a house. It wasn't enough to employ torture, but nevertheless, and of course, this is why we know Wade was there, and he gives his testimony to it, because his lieutenant of the tower, he always had to be present when torture was used. So Owen is racked a few more times, doesn't give up any information, so eventually he's executed by hanging, drawing, and quartering. Doesn't give up anything, even though he's got, and the torture he must have gone through was just terrible. Doesn't give anything up. And there's a few other people tortured in such a way, but Owen was the key once they realized he was their guy.
But how convenient! How convenient is all this? Now, I just want to interject before we wrap up. There's a couple of things here. If you look at a map, and remember, you're speaking at the start of the 17th century here, 1605. You look at a map and you see where London is, and then look at where Flanders is. And I'm looking at it on a map in present-day northern Belgium, basically. This is not a hop, skip, and a jump. So if you're going to transport gunpowder there, you're going to have to do it. And first of all, you have to get over the land. Then you have to get to the Thames. Then you got to get to the Thames out into the sea. And then you got to get across the channel there. Then you got to get it on land. And then you got to transport it about 60 miles on land again. This doesn't make any sense. Why wouldn't you make it in Flanders?
Right. Well, it's a war zone, and the thing is that if you're supplying the English regiment, you had to actually bring your own. So that part of it actually makes a little bit of sense.
But it decays, though. Let's go back to the decay part. This is what's throwing me.
Oh, yeah. And so the decayed part, again, what it shows is that, in my opinion anyway, it shows clearly that the government gave them a bomb that wouldn't work.
Right, okay.
And the thing is, like in the last days of November 2nd and 3rd, more gunpowder deliveries, and these are the first ones that are overseen by Fawkes. So Fawkes can actually view this, so this may very well have been real and true gunpowder that Fawkes is saying, maybe because he was having doubts or concerns about something. Who knows? But this is the only actual gunpowder shipment he oversees. Right, so this way, when they've finished their recruitment for the English regiment and they come over, they already come over supplied. Because back then, armies had to have their, they had to bring their own stuff, basically.
Okay.
And you even see this in the English Civil War, the armies fighting for either king or parliament, they had to supply their own gear. So noblemen would have a retinue of cavalry that they would bring to the table, or vice versa. On either side of that war. And that's the same thing how it happens even on the continent. You still don't have a real, true, paid professional army until Cromwell, basically, until the 1644-45 when you have the creation of what's called the New Model Army, or the first Redcoats, actually. because they were red because that was the cheapest dye. Before that, you bring your own stuff. And so the English regiment would have to bring its own stuff to fight for the Duke Albert, who was the Duke of the Spanish Netherlands, on behalf of the king, which at this time was Philip III. So they'd have to do that, and that's why they have the gunpowder, and that's why they need to take it down the Medway, and then get it transferred to a boat, go up the sea, and all this stuff was fairly routine as far as transmitting goods and things, and if that's what it was really all about, a certain amount of secrecy, because the English government might say, okay, well, you can go to Flanders, but we're confiscating your gunpowder. And so that's their main interest, is to avoid anything like that. And so, that's the reason it's plausible, again, why Fawkes is using an assumed name, why, at the same time, he's very confident and giving very confident, even after the first round of torture, confession that he's just recruiting and sitting there watching stuff for the English regiment. So anyway, so there's a thrilling conclusion. So all of these guys are hanged, drawn, and quartered, and the net snaps on all these other fellows that we mentioned, like the Jesuit Henry Garnet, Edward Oldcorn, Nicholas Owen, the Catholic noble ladies like Anne Vaugh, others that they're all arrested, their lands confiscated, they lose everything. So you made a huge breaking of Catholic England, but it's even worse. So previously, Catholics are thought well of, especially in the North, by their Protestant neighbors, because they have experience of each other, and they are neighbors after all. So they see the good lives that they live under and say, I'd rather have these papists around than some of my own Anglican clergy. and that's the feeling in a lot of places, particularly in the North. So that, like, Edmund Campion is able to boast of the good morals of Catholics and how they make good citizens, etc. So, and this is something that Cecil needs to take care of. And there's an interesting anecdote from the 1670s. Now, at that time, of course, you have what's called the Titus Oates plot. If you ever want to do a show on that makes a really interesting history.
What is it called? The what plot?
It's called the Titus Oates plot. At the time, it was actually called the Popish plot. And that was where they were alleging that there's a conspiracy of Catholics to kill the king, which was Charles II, put his brother on the throne and start take away everyone's Bibles and make them worship the Virgin Mary and such things. So it actually became really, one historian called it the single greatest instance of mass delusion in English society, because there really was no Catholic conspiracy to take over and destroy and start killing Protestants. But it's made for good writing. And, of course, that brought out more discussion of Guy Fawkes and the Gunpowder Plot, the narrative. So here is what a man named Peschal explained to someone who was treated, to a sheriff who was treating Catholics nicely, and this is from Gentleman's Magazine, January 1788. Wrong one. This is from Dr. Thomas Barlow. The Gunpowder Treason, with a discourse of the manner of its discovery and a perfect relation of the proceedings against this horrid conspirators. And so he gives this a relation of a document from Cecil that he saw specifically, although it's disappeared from the archives, but he's given testimony that he's looking at this document in 1679. So this is Dr. Thomas Barlow saying to Peschal, who's the sheriff who's treating papists nicely. He says, "Sir, I am studying politics. They have made me president of their council, and I am reading Mr. Secretary Cecil's instructions left to them. And pray you see how papists are to be dealt with. For this, I assure you, is the secretary's own hand." Okay, and so he gives it to him, and he continues that penal laws against Catholics must never be repealed, but that when they perceived that by their connivance and forbearing to put them in execution, the papists began to be too popular and agreeable, both to their neighbors in the country and to their friends and relations at court, then to obviate and allay this good opinion of their relations and neighbors, the ministry must be sure to fix some odious design upon them, which would never fail to be believed by the generality of the common people. And then they might put the penal laws in execution, to what degree they should think necessary against them. And the people would think them kind and favorable to let them live. But they must never permit or suffer themselves to be prevailed with to take off the penal laws, but reserve them as a bridle to keep the papists out of all public employ in their country. and to depress them whenever they should think it necessary, or find them grow more numerous or in greater favor and esteem with their neighbors. Okay, and so that, and essentially that's what happened in roughly 1679. That was what was going on. You had the Test Act. You tried to make sure Catholics could never serve in government. You had the fact that the heir to the throne, James, the brother of Charles II, because he was childless, James was Catholic, and then you would have a Catholic king. And that's one of the things that brought about and generated the Oates plot, right? So the aftermath and the legacy of Guy Fawkes, one, anti-Catholicism in England got so much stronger. The Gunpowder Plot is brought up again and again and again in English history as reasons to distrust Catholics. In 1850, when the hierarchy was restored, Guy Fawkes Day was celebrated with renewed vigor, and more you had public press things. That's what provoked Father John Gerard, another Father John Gerard, the Jesuit, to write a book, What Was the Gunpowder Plot, which is what started this serious investigation into these. The American colonies. Guy Fawkes Day was called Pope Day because part of Guy Fawkes Day celebrations is you burn the Pope in effigy.
Yes.
The government played up very strong. Now, actually, there's documents in the Vatican. I've seen one of them. Edwards gives a few others. So the one that I have seen personally is Pope Paul V, in his own hand, it's written in Italian, orders the Jesuit Superior General Aquaviva, to pull any and all Jesuits out of England as soon as possible, because word was spreading about a plot of terrible action which will have horrible consequences on Catholics. There's some terrible thing that's to be done. And so Aquaviva sent the letter, but the instructions were never sent to England. Right. So Edwards also gives a letter from Aquaviva to all the Jesuit houses to make sure that no Jesuits are having anything to do with politics in England. That if they're there, they're only there for the faith. And for at least 6 months, they all need to come back out of England. Now, those instructions never got to Garnet, principally because they're in hiding. It's hard to get them instructions like that. So it's one of those issues. So the Pope and the Jesuits at large had nothing to do with the plot. They were rather ensnared by that. And even those who argued that this was cooked up by these guys and then the state saw it and let it widen, well, that even they admit, too, that for the most part, that the Jesuits, you see this in Antonio Fraser, Alice Hodges, a few other treatments on the subject where, they did not, the Jesuits themselves did not have any direct activity involved in the Gunpowder Plot. So, and neither did the Pope. But nevertheless, so they needed to use the propaganda to fix this in the public's mind. Now, today, when they want to do that, they show you the same image again and again and again on TV. Because you remember after 9/11, and it's just constant. That's all they're showing on every news hour for the next 6 months is planes crashing into a building, planes crashing into a building. They're trying to set the propaganda of why you must now do whatever the government says because this happened. And I'm not going to address any 9/11 conspiracy theory stuff here today. I'm just trying to mention this is how, irrespective of the provenance of the attack, the government is using the propaganda victory however it can to justify whatever it wants, even a war it approved on September 4th, namely in Afghanistan. So the same thing is going on here in England. So they don't have TV, but they still try their very best. So you have woodcuts galore of Guy Fawkes with the lantern, the spurs, and the hat. It's like this iconic thing. All right,
it still is today.
The House of Parliament. It still is today.
It still is today iconic.
You have circulars in German, in French, in even in Danish, right, to go to Denmark. That's probably because the Queen is Danish. But anyway, Queen Anne, who is James's wife. But so they have these woodcuts, circulars, pamphlets of all of these elements of the official government narrative. You see things, Guy Fawkes going into the bottom of Parliament. And actually, I posted it on my Facebook this morning. And the Pope is sitting there having tea with the devil and a Jesuit and a Franciscan and kind of giving a nod to Guy Fawkes going into Parliament. But at the top, there's God's name written in Hebrew and an eye, and it's looking down with the light, and there's words written on there, Video, Redeo. I see and I smile, or I see and I mock, as it may be. The pamphlet says I smile, but Redeo, I laugh, I smile, I mock, right? And so they get things like that. Well, there's other ones with the Pope having, is sitting there, and the devil is flying away from the Pope and going to Guy Fawkes. And so as a result, when they craft the celebrations, first it always has, Guy Fawkes Day always has fireworks, which they'll be doing in England very shortly because they're about 7 hours ahead of you, 9 hours ahead of me.
Right.
And the fireworks are supposed to represent the celebration with the gunpowder that Fawkes couldn't detonate, which, as we've seen from the contemporary evidence, would never have gone off anyway. And then, it has several cakes. It also ends with burning the Pope in effigy.
So will they now? Will they actually? They will burn a Pope in effigy today? They'll burn.
Not everywhere in England, but there are some places in England where they will burn a Pope in effigy.
So basically, to summarize, folks, and I can only give like a 30-second summary. Basically, to summarize, the Gunpowder Plot is a plot that is constructed so that what appears to be a rising sentimentality for Catholics and for Catholicism in England by paranoid Protestant English must be put down. And this elaborate contraption here it's stitched together out of the actual of what is actually occurring in England at the time. That when you look back on it, historically speaking, is just all too convenient to put this plot together, and of course, lay it at the feet of all these evil, despicable Catholics who were going to. And by the way, to say nothing of the fact that this is a totally unjust war move here. So the fact that a priest is supposedly involved, the whole thing just stinks. And like I like to say about 9/11, Ryan, and you brought it up, so I don't have to be the Alex Jones conspiracy theorist here. I like to say, what are the results of the propaganda? TSA, people surrendering in the Millway thing at the airport, all of the civil liberties that have been eviscerated and what have you. Look at the results of whether or not it's a conspiracy or not. Look at the results of it.
The prominence is it really doesn't matter whether I frankly don't believe that George Bush and Dick Cheney are sitting there. Oh, let's have planes going into buildings. That'd be great. It could be that there's some connivance on that side, but I think there's a multiplicity of involvement of various actors, and it's something rather that either was allowed to happen or happened. But then again, but you need to have the evidence. See, in this case, what we're doing is we're showing the evidence that shows the inconsistencies and leads to the clear case that the government has all the interest in play to do this, and certainly is reaping the benefits out of it. Right, and so there is a parallel with 9/11 on those fronts, and so there's certainly a complicity there. In the official story we got was a lie, and there's so many holes in the official stories, worse than half the conspiracy theories. 9/11, and you see that kind of back here, kind of in the foundation of all false flag terror attacks.
Well, there you have it. And that's the summary. Ryan, thank you very much. Wow, what an eye opener. Let's do that follow-up interview on the Oaks plot. And talk about, or the Papist plot, and talk about that soon.
All right, sounds good.
Find Ryan online, mediatrixpress.com. We actually could probably do another hour on this. Maybe we should. Happy Guy Fawkes Day to you.